In the year 536, a Byzantine official and historian named Procopius, traveling with the general Belisarius on campaign in Italy, wrote something that reads at first glance like literary exaggeration. He wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, for the whole year, and that it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, because the beams it shed were not clear. He wasn't describing a single afternoon or a passing storm. He was describing, as far as anyone could tell at the time, the sun itself failing to work properly for months on end across the entire known world. For nearly 1,500 years, historians treated this as poetic flourish, the kind of dramatic language ancient writers used to signal that bad things were happening politically. Then, starting in the early 2000s, ice core samples and tree ring records from 3 separate continents began independently confirming that Procopius wasn't exaggerating anything. Something genuinely blocked the sun in 536 AD on a hemispheric scale, and it triggered what the medieval historian Michael McCormick, in a frequently cited 2018 paper, described in blunt, almost startling language for an academic publication. Quote, "The worst year to be alive. Not the worst decade, not the worst century, the worst single year, in the opinion of a serious Harvard historian working from converging physical and textual evidence in the entirety of recorded human history." This is the story of what actually happened in 536 AD, why it happened, and why it kicked off a decade that historians increasingly believe reshaped the trajectory of the ancient world. Not through war, not through a single empire's decision, but through something almost nobody at the time could have possibly identified as the actual cause. If real, documented mysteries hiding in plain sight across history are why you're here, subscribe and turn on notifications. We go looking for the next one every week. The written record for 536 is unusually rich, precisely because so many different unconnected societies across the ancient world happened to be literate and observant enough to record what they were seeing, and their accounts, gathered independently by modern historians, line up with an almost eerie consistency. In the Eastern Roman Empire, besides Procopius, another chronicler named John of Ephesus wrote that the sun was dark for 1.5 years, and that during each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. A Roman senator named Cassiodorus, writing from Italy, described a sun with a bluish color, noted that the moon, even at its fullest, had no light, and observed that the seasons seemed confused, with an entire year passing that showed no distinguishable summer, spring, or winter. Halfway around the world, Chinese court records from the same period, compiled in official dynastic histories, describe yellow dust raining down like snow in the year 536, and separately record summer snowfall in a region called Datong, an occurrence considered significant enough that court astronomers and officials noted it as a formal anomaly requiring explanation. Irish chronicles, compiled from monastic annals, record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539, language historians interpret as a description of repeated grain harvest failures across consecutive growing seasons. Records from the Middle East, including Syriac chronicles, describe a similarly darkened sun and disrupted season. None of these observers, separated by thousands of miles with no meaningful communication between most of them, could have coordinated a shared exaggeration. What they were independently describing was a real atmospheric event, severe enough to be noticed, recorded, and treated as extraordinary by literate elites on at least 3 separate continents in the same narrow window of time. For most of the 20th century, this cluster of ancient reports sat in historical journals as an interesting but unresolved curiosity, evocative testimony, but without a physical mechanism anyone could confidently attach to it. That changed with the development of 2 entirely independent scientific techniques, neither of which existed when these ancient chronicles were first studied: ice core analysis and dendrochronology, the science of dating and analyzing tree rings. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica preserve, in extraordinarily fine-grained annual layers, a chemical record of the atmosphere going back tens of thousands of years. When a major volcanic eruption injects sulfate aerosols high into the stratosphere, those aerosols eventually settle, in measurable concentrations, into the snow and ice accumulating at the poles that same year. Researchers analyzing these ice cores identified a massive, unambiguous sulfate spike dated to 536 AD, indicating a major volcanic eruption powerful enough to inject material directly into the stratosphere. The atmospheric layer high enough for aerosols to spread globally and remain suspended for extended periods rather than settling out locally within weeks, the way lower altitude ash does. Tree ring evidence independently confirmed the ice core data in a way that's genuinely difficult to argue with, because tree rings and polar ice cores are about as physically unrelated as two lines of scientific evidence can, and yet they told the same story. Trees grow a new ring every year, and the width of that ring reflects the growing conditions of that specific year. A severe, sudden global cooling event shows up as an unusually narrow ring, sometimes called a frost ring, across trees from completely different species and regions simultaneously. Dendrochronologists studying tree ring records from Scandinavia, the Austrian Alps and Siberia, working independently of each other, all identified an extreme, abrupt narrowing beginning in 536, indicating a sudden, severe drop in growing season temperatures across multiple, disconnected parts of the Northern Hemisphere in the same year. A 2016 study led by climate scientist Ulf Bündgen, synthesizing tree ring records across a broad swath of Europe, concluded that the period beginning in 536 marked the beginning of what researchers now formally call the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a sustained cooling period lasting more than a century, triggered not by one event, but by a rare cluster of closely spaced major volcanic eruptions. This is the critical detail that makes 536 different from an ordinary single bad year, and it's a genuinely important nuance that separates careful modern research from the older, simpler version of this story. It wasn't just one eruption. Ice core evidence indicates a very large eruption in early 536. Most researchers now suspect, based on geochemical fingerprinting, was likely centered in Iceland, though the exact volcano and precise location remain a subject of ongoing scientific investigation. Then, remarkably, before the climate could fully recover, a second major eruption struck around 540 and a third potentially around 547, creating a compounding, cascading cooling effect rather than a single sharp shock followed by recovery. This is part of why McCormick's characterization carries real scientific weight rather than being simple hyperbole. The written accounts of prolonged darkness, lasting up to 18 months rather than a few weeks, match almost perfectly with a physical model of repeated eruptions preventing the stratospheric aerosol veil from clearing, each new eruption effectively topping up an atmospheric dimming effect that a single eruption alone would have allowed to fade within a year or two. The actual climatic mechanism, once you understand volcanic winters generally, is straightforward physics, even though its ancient consequences were anything but simple. Sulfate aerosols injected into the stratosphere reflect a portion of incoming sunlight back into space before it reaches the ground, and because the stratosphere sits above the weather systems that normally clear the lower atmosphere within days, these aerosols can remain suspended, spreading globally on wind current for months, or in this compounded case, years. Global surface temperatures, by some tree ring-based reconstructions, may have dropped by as much as 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius in the years immediately following 536 across large parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Figures that sound modest in the abstract, but represent a genuinely severe agricultural shock, because it's not the average temperature that destroys a harvest. It's a shortened, unpredictable growing season, combined with unseasonal frosts hitting crops at exactly the wrong developmental stage. For societies in this period, almost entirely dependent on annual grain harvests with limited capacity for long-distance food storage or import at scale, a single severely shortened growing season could be catastrophic. Multiple consecutive shortened seasons, layered on top of each other across nearly a full decade because of the repeated eruptions, appear to have produced exactly the kind of famine conditions the Irish chronicles "failure of bread" and similar accounts from other regions describe. This wasn't localized bad luck. It was a hemispheric agricultural disruption lasting years, hitting the Byzantine Mediterranean, continental Europe, and parts of East Asia simultaneously, at a moment when none of these societies had any conceptual framework for understanding what was happening to their sky, let alone any tool for predicting when it would end. And the story gets darker still, because 536 feats, climate shock appears to have set the stage, both ecologically and socially, for what came next. Beginning in 541, just 5 years after Procopius watched a dim, colorless sun over Italy, the Byzantine Empire was struck by an outbreak of bubonic plague that historians call the Plague of Justinian, after the emperor who ruled through it. Contemporary accounts, From the historian Procopius again, who by remarkable historical coincidence documented both events firsthand, described mortality in Constantinople so severe that officials eventually stopped counting the dead altogether, with some ancient estimates claiming the city lost thousands of people daily at the outbreak's peak. Modern historians treat the specific ancient death tolls with appropriate caution, since ancient chroniclers were prone to dramatic round numbers. But even conservative modern reconstructions, based on burial and administrative records where they survive, describe mortality severe enough to have measurably disrupted Byzantine tax collection, military recruitment, and urban labor for years afterwards. Whether the 536 climate shock directly caused the plague outbreak that followed it is a genuinely live, actively debated question among historians and epidemiologists, and it's worth being precise about the current state of that debate, rather than overselling a clean causal chain. Some researchers have proposed that widespread crop failure and subsequent famine could have driven both increased rodent activity around human food stores and weakened human immune resilience simultaneously, creating more favorable conditions for a Yersinia pestis outbreak to take hold and spread explosively once it arrived. This remains a plausible, actively researched hypothesis rather than a settled scientific fact, and other historians reasonably point out that plague dynamics are complex enough that a direct causal chain from volcanic winter to pandemic outbreak 5 years later is difficult to prove with certainty from the surviving evidence. What is not seriously disputed is the striking, if not fully explained, temporal coincidence. A hemispheric climate catastrophe followed, within half a decade, by one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, both striking the same Mediterranean world within the same narrow generational window. The combined economic and demographic effects of the climate shock and the plague that followed it are visible in the broader historical record in ways that go well beyond the immediate crisis years. Archaeological evidence across large parts of Europe shows a documented contraction in trade, construction activity, and coin circulation in the mid-6th century, consistent with a broader economic slowdown that several historians now connect directly to this compounded climate and pandemic crisis. The Byzantine Empire under Justinian had, in the years immediately before 536, been engaged in an ambitious military campaign to reconquer the western Mediterranean territories lost to Rome, including the Italian campaign Procopius himself was chronicling when he described the dimmed sun. Some historians, McCormick prominently among them, have argued that the compounding strain of climate-driven famine and plague-driven demographic collapse meaningfully undermined the Byzantine Empire's capacity to sustain and consolidate those reconquests over subsequent decades, contributing to a broader and longer process of Byzantine retrenchment that unfolded across the following century. Though this remains one contributing factor among several that historians weigh differently, rather than a single isolated cause. It's worth stepping back and being honest about what the evidence does and doesn't fully establish, because that honesty is exactly what makes this story credible rather than overstated. The physical evidence, the ice core sulfate spikes, the independently corroborating tree ring data from multiple disconnected regions, the cluster of closely timed volcanic eruptions, is about as solid as paleoclimate reconstruction gets, converging from completely unrelated scientific methods to tell the same consistent story. The written testimony from Byzantine, Chinese, Irish, and Middle Eastern sources, independently describing a darkened sun and disrupted seasons in the same narrow window, adds a rare layer of human, textual confirmation to what could otherwise have remained a purely physical science finding. Where legitimate scholarly uncertainty remains is in the more specific causal claims layered on top of that solid foundation. Which exact volcano erupted first, and where precisely it was located? How directly the climate shock is causally connected to the plague outbreak 5 years later? And how much weight to assign the 536 event specifically, versus the broader century-long late antique Little Ice Age it kicked off, in explaining the slower, more complex political transformations of the following decades? What isn't in serious doubt is the core fact that gives this story its power. For a period of roughly 18 months, and in a compounded, rolling fashion for years afterwards, people across 3 continents looked up at a sky that had stopped working correctly, with absolutely no framework for understanding why, no way to predict when it would end, and no tool available to them beyond religious explanation and desperate endurance. Procopius reached for the language of eclipse because it was the closest concept he had. He was, in a very real sense, an eyewitness to a genuine planetary event, describing with total accuracy something whose actual mechanism, sulfate aerosols from a volcano most likely thousands of miles from where he was standing, drifting through the stratosphere and scattering sunlight across the entire northern hemisphere, wouldn't be understood by anyone for another 1,400 and some years. The tree rings that finally proved him right are still out there, in living and long-dead trees across Scandinavia and Siberia and the Alps, holding a single unnaturally narrow ring laid down in the exact year a Byzantine historian watched a colourless sun crawl across the Italian sky and wrote down, as precisely as he knew how, that something had gone fundamentally wrong with the natural order of the world. It had. It just took the rest of human science roughly a millennium and a half to catch up to what he'd already seen with his own eyes.